This is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This is the story of Thomas Drewery, a man who was accused of theft, found guilty, and sentenced to 7 years transportation for a crime he didn't commit. Ripped away from his loving family, disgraced in front of his friends and community, imprisoned and then transported to the other side of the world, he left behind the only home he had ever known, and he left his family in poverty. This is about the fight to clear his name. It was a colder than average August day in 1845 when a man strolled into an inn in Wakefield of West Yorkshire, England. The lunchtime rush was just starting to die down when the man struck up a conversation with the waitress. He orders a bottle of lemonade and inquires if there is a horse and gig he can hire for the day. He explains he has business in Stanley, a town about 3 or 4 miles away, and he should be back by 7 or 8 that evening. The man drains his bottle of lemonade as the groom prepares the horse and gig. The brown mare stands at roughly 14 hands high, and as the man steps up into the two-wheeled gig, the waitress and groom ask for his details. He tells them his name is Thomas Drewery of Hull, thus setting in motion a series of events that would change the lives of many. The man's real name was John Webster. He was from Newcastle upon Tyne and worked as a grocer. He had caught the train up that day and randomly selected the inn. After securing his horse and gig, he rode past Stanley and headed back to Newcastle, where a week later he sold the gig at auction and exchanged the horse for another one at Newcastle Fair. Around the time Webster was gleefully pocketing the money for the gig, the real Thomas Drewery of Hull was having irons slapped on his wrists and was being led to the watch house. Thomas Drewery was a young man of about 23 years of age. He was happily married to a woman named Elizabeth, and the pair had 2 young children together. He had a respectable job as a druggist in a chemist store in Hull that was streets away from where he was born. In July 1845, Thomas headed to Leeds to have a much-deserved holiday with friends. However, that abruptly ended on the 12th of August when he and his friend Abraham Wilkinson returned to York and Thomas was seized by police. Thomas was kept locked up until his trial a month later. His case was heard at the Quarter Sessions at Wakefield Courthouse. The prosecution had 3 witnesses on the day, but Thomas didn't have the funds to find and pay witnesses to come to his trial, so he had just his good friend Abraham to stand up for him. One by one, the 3 witnesses for the prosecution stood up and told the jury what they'd seen. All 3 were employees of the inn. 2 swore an oath that the man they had seen was indeed the man standing before them in the court. However, the waitress, Jane Armitage, who had spent the most time talking to the man who hired the horse, wasn't 100% sure it was him. She thought it was him. It certainly looked a lot like him, but she wouldn't swear to it. There was that tiny, niggling doubt. When it was Abraham's turn to get up, he confidently explained to the jury that it could not possibly be the same man, as Thomas had been with him day and night since he arrived in July in Leeds, a town 10 miles away. So it would have come as quite a shock when the judge handed down the verdict of guilty. Thomas had been so sure that the truth would set him free and return him to his beloved family. The jury just wouldn't believe one man, a friend at that, over 2 credible witnesses. It was such a heavy blow for Thomas and his family, as there was no appeal system. Once a person was found guilty, that was it. Thomas was shuffled between York Castle and Millbank Prison, one festering prison to the other, before being sent on to Pentonville Prison. He did not give up hope and was determined to fight for his innocence. He decided to write as many letters as he could to whoever would listen to try and get the case reheard. After all, he now had a lot of time on his hands and he planned to use it productively. He couldn't bear the thought of what might become of his beloved Elizabeth and their 2 children. Without him and his steady wage from the chemist, they would have absolutely no means in which to live. He shuddered at the very thought. He immediately spurred into action and started writing letters to people he thought might be able to help them. The only problem was, Pentonville Prison had strict rules, and one of them was that prisoners could only receive 1 letter every 6 months and only 1 visitor every 6 months. Meanwhile, his wife and friends approached a solicitor by the name of Mr. Edward Sidebottom for help, even though they didn't have the means to pay him. Sidebottom agreed to represent Thomas and fight for his release if he believed him to be innocent, so he set about reading the facts of the case and made his own inquiries. Sidebottom travelled to Leeds to track down more witnesses and found 4 credible people who were willing to testify that they had seen Thomas at the time of the robbery. Armed with this knowledge, Sidebottom agreed to take up the case and have the new witnesses write up affidavits supporting Thomas's alibi. Sidebottom presented these affidavits, along with a letter he had written on behalf of Thomas's wife Elizabeth, to the Home Office, pleading them to re-examine the case and overturn Thomas's sentence. Want to hear more great stories about convicts? Then grab a copy of Convict Sydney, the real-life stories of 32 prisoners. From Elizabeth Sullivan, who was known about town as the fighting hen of Cook's River, with her flamboyant dress and tough countenance, to Robert Sidaway, who entertained local residents by hosting dramatic performances in his theatre. These colourful characters and their individual experiences offer a broader insight into the daily happenings of Sydney and the convict system. To get your copy, just click on the link in the show notes. Sidebottom eagerly awaited a letter from the Home Office, and when it arrived, he tore it open with haste. But his exuberance turned to disappointment as he read from Sir James Graham, quote, that to release or acquit a prisoner upon evidence corroboratory of alibi pleaded at the trial was without precedent. End quote. Sidebottom couldn't believe what he was reading. He must have been outraged that the system he had spent his adult life studying and practicing, the very system that he believed in passionately, could let an innocent man serve time for a crime he did not commit. It was almost too much to bear. This was the turning point that made Sidebottom become so invested in seeing Thomas's sentence overturned, no matter what the cost. He was determined to set this man free. He personally sought out an interview with Sir Walter C. James, member for Hull, and persuaded him to write a letter to the Home Office in regards to Thomas's case. Sir James agreed to write the letter requesting that the matter be brought to the attention of Her Majesty the Queen for mitigation of the sentence. They received their reply on the 27th of April 1846. Sir James Graham continues of the same opinion as before, namely that he would not be warranted in advising a mitigation of the sentence in this case. Sir James Graham has seen the full report of the evidence at the trial of the prisoner, who was defended by counsel, and his defence was an alibi. Fresh declarations are now submitted to Sir James Graham's consideration with a view to strengthen the alibi set up at the trial, which the jury could not have believed. But these declarations have not been made upon oath, nor have they been submitted to cross-examination. Sir James Graham cannot, therefore, consider them as entitled to weight of legitimate evidence. I am directed to add that Sir James Graham has fully considered the case and sees no ground for deciding the propriety either of the verdict or the judgment. End quote. At this point, most people would have given up, but not Sidebottom. He approached another member for Parliament and convinced him to also send a letter to the Home Office. Sadly, This was rejected too. Sidebottom had exhausted every avenue and to his utter frustration did not think he could proceed any further. All his efforts had been played out in the local newspapers, and something good had actually come of it. The story had drummed up sympathy for Thomas and his family, and one very kind lady living in Regent's Park wrote to Elizabeth. She said she had been following the case and expressed her deepest sympathies and told her that she had left her £2 with the editor of the Morning Post. She hoped that her gift would set an example and other people would follow her lead. And it did. Once the papers published news of her kind donation, money started to flow in. Sadly, Thomas's time had come for transportation. On the 2nd of June 1847, the Joseph Soames set sail for Van Diemen's Land with Thomas on board. Thomas and his family and friends must have felt dejected, all sense of hope for his release gone. Thoughts must have run through his head that he may never see his family again. But just as the ship loses sight of England, taking Thomas further and further away from his family and the only home he's ever known, an extraordinary turn of events happens. Over in Van Diemen's Land, a convict turns to his mate one night and asks him if he's heard about the story of Thomas Drewery of Hull. The name rings a bell, but he can't quite place it. As the convict listens to his mate regale the sorry tale, a feeling of dread washes over him as he realises that he was the one who stole the horse and gig. Thomas Drewery had been sentenced for a crime that he, John Webster, had committed. He couldn't believe it. He felt an overwhelming sense of horror and guilt. He decided he could not live with himself if he let another man suffer for a crime that he was guilty of. Webster immediately started making inquiries to find out if the details were correct. The more he learnt, the more he was convinced that he was guilty of the crime. So he wrote a letter in the hope of clearing Thomas's name. After outlining what he did in as much detail as he could remember, he stated, quote, "It is for the benefit of Mr. Drewery and his suffering family that I make these facts known to you, sincerely hoping that you will make these sad truths known to some good Christians in England, and that by your united energies an innocent, injured man may be restored to his friends and to the sympathies of the English public. Sir, I believe you will pardon the great freedom I have taken, and I beg to subscribe myself. Yours, a wretched convict, John Webster." End quote. The letter is dated June 14th, 1847. Thomas's ship had left 12 days before it was written. Webster hands the letter to Reverend G. Walter and begs him to send it to the right people in England. So as Thomas is making his way to Australia, trying to come to terms with his bleak new future, little does he know that the letter, his ticket to freedom, is on a ship travelling in the opposite direction. Several months later, on the 10th of September, the Joseph Soames sails into Hobart, Van Diemen's Land. It is discovered that in a book at the government station that, quote, John Webster states that a person by the name of Drewery, formerly a druggist in Hull, has been transported for 7 years, charges with an offence of which he himself is committed, end quote. One can only imagine how Thomas felt when he heard the news. Thomas spends only 4 days in Hobart, probably in shock and disbelief, before being shipped off again to Port Phillip. He arrives in Geelong on the 24th of September. It's his birthday. Upon arrival, all the convicts he is with are granted a conditional pardon. This means that Thomas is a free man, but cannot leave the colony and return home. It has now been over 2 years since he was arrested. Thomas remains on board a few days, then catches a steamer down to Melbourne, where he inquires about work from local surgeons and druggists and manages to secure himself a position. He then writes to his wife Elizabeth, telling her the good news. Quote, "My dear, here are fresh proofs of your husband's innocence." End quote. He tells her about his journey and his new position. He is clearly over the moon, writing, quote, "Liberty, sweet liberty." End quote. He describes his life in Melbourne and the opportunities available. He sounds so enthusiastic about life in Australia and writes, quote, "The only compensation I ask is that the government will send you and my dear children out to me respectably, not as the wife of a convict, but as one whose husband has been shamefully used. I have no wish to return yet. I can do better here." End quote. He asks Elizabeth to tell the press so that his innocence can be proclaimed in the newspapers, which she does. When John Webster's letter arrives in England, Sidebottom requests an interview with Sir George Grey at the Home Office. After reading the letter and the affidavits from the new witnesses, the Home Secretary agrees to investigate the case. He looks into the character and station of the 4 new witnesses and Webster's description of the events, particularly his description of the horse. He found the witnesses to be reliable and the description from Webster to be mostly spot on. It was concluded that the 2 witnesses who had sworn it was Thomas must have been mistaken. Sir George Grey issued the free pardon that very day and had it dispatched to Van Diemen's Land on the very next vessel. There was still the question of compensation, though. The Drewery family had no money. Thomas couldn't afford to pay the passage back to England, and his wife certainly didn't have the money to take her and her children to join him. Although Thomas had written to his wife saying that he preferred her and the kids to come to him and live in Australia, he had written that not knowing for certain that he could leave the country. So a letter from Elizabeth was written asking him what he wanted her to do, and it was sent to him along with the pardon. In the meantime, the whole story was still being told in the local newspapers. People felt so sorry for the Drewery family that money continued pouring in for Thomas and his family. Even the prison chaplain, Joseph Kingsmill, of the Pentonville prison that met Thomas during his time there, said that he wanted to contribute to the fund to give Thomas a new start. By January 28, 1848, the newspaper reported that they had already raised £50. That was about a year's salary for some. Banks and newspapers all played a role in collecting the money. When the news finally arrived that confirmed that Thomas wanted his wife and children to join him in Australia, Elizabeth wasted no more time. She packed up their home and belongings, and on Monday the 22nd of May, 1848, Elizabeth and her children set sail from London on the ship Royal George. The government paid for their passage, bedding and clothing, etc. And of course she had the money that the public had raised for them. She was finally going to see her husband and the children their father after over 3 long years. The ship arrived on the 13th of September 1848, and shortly after that the family were reunited and they lived out their days in Melbourne. I hope you enjoyed the story. I got so choked up as I read the outcome of this sorry tale. When I think of the length of time he spent in prison serving out his sentence and how long it took to be reunited after proving his innocence, this poor man missed out on the early years of his children's lives, watching them grow and knowing that he had left them in abject poverty. It breaks my heart. I went to bed that night dreaming of their reunion after so many years apart. It really makes you think how lucky they were to be able to overturn this. And it makes me wonder how many others were convicted of a crime they never committed.